Hi guys, this is the video for week 2. We're still not starting on the composition of your business message just yet. So starting in week 3, we're going to be starting uh, with uh, with your composition of a business message. We're going to go through those processes and habits that we talked about in week 1. Right. So we're not doing that yet. What we're doing this week is an example of a rhetorical analysis, as well as you are going to be reading a piece from the Harvard Business Review and answering some questions about it. So let's start with that. So the piece is by Carolyn O'Hara. It's titled "How to Improve Your Business Writing," right? And you probably see these articles all the time on LinkedIn or on Facebook. They get very popular. It's kind of shared and they get kind of viral. Forbes writes a lot of these pieces. Harvard Business Review writes a lot of these pieces. A lot of Business Insider writes a lot of these pieces. There are a variety of different publication outlets that always kind of claim to have the antidote to poor writing, right? Or claim to have all the answers about here are the 5 things you could do to improve your writing. There's actually a video embedded in there by the editor-in-chief of the Harvard Business Review, Brian Garner, where he talks about the 5 things you need to know to improve your writing. And these are all good steps, right? But it's important to know that there is no specific gospel on the absolute 5 things you need to do to improve your writing, right? It's just not that simple. So I would encourage you to be skeptical of those pieces. However, we're going to read through one of them because you can take specific, maybe 1 or 2 things out of each of those articles and kind of think about how it applies to your specific context to improve your own writing, right? So it's not like don't print it out, put it on the wall, and just kind of think, okay, if I do these 5 things, I will be a good writer, right? So because one of the examples is speak like you talk. So in one of the videos, Brian Garner, the editor-in-chief of Harvard Business Review, so someone that Carolyn O'Hara mentions in the piece I'm having you read, says, write like you speak. Use contractions. Use don't. Use won't, etc., etc. And that's generally good for everyday kind of semi-formal or kind of casual business communication. That's completely fine. Internal memos, emails, informal reports that you're doing, or proposals you're giving to a superior for something, or whatever it is, right? That's fine. But if you're writing, obviously, something that's more public, that's more PR-centric, right? Whether that's like a mea culpa that you're reading, actually, that Target had to write after the data breach a few years back, and you'll be analyzing that. We'll get into that in a sec. Or any sort of news about layoffs or anything like that has to be public-centric. Well, then that rule doesn't necessarily apply, right? So it's important that we distinguish in writing and rhetoric. It's very important that we distinguish between rules and conventions, right? So what I get from students in this class is a lot of questions of, can I do this, or is it this way, or is it that way, right? Can I use I or can I not use I? Or can I use contractions? Can I not use contractions? Can I use a semicolon? Can I not use a semicolon? Right? How long do paragraphs have to be? Do they have to be 5 sentences? Can they be longer, et cetera, right? And my response is always going to be, frustratingly, it depends, right? Because there are no rules. Because as soon as you think there is a rule to something, you are going to see it completely broken in another context and used very effectively. And you're going to think, okay, well, my English teacher lied to me, or this rule is incorrect, right? But it's not that the rule is incorrect. What's incorrect is the notion that there are rules in the first place, right? So with language and with writing specifically, what we have are conventions, right? And people break and change these conventions all the time, right? So what you have to be aware of is, and this is where the rhetorical situation comes in, right? This is where rhetoric comes in general, right? So if you think of rhetoric as being able to craft your message as effectively for that specific audience, right? That's kind of the gist of rhetoric. Is assessing a message's appropriateness or effectiveness based upon that audience. What that is, the assumption there is that the language is contingent, and that what might work for one audience does not necessarily work for another audience. That's kind of the base foundation of rhetoric and the base foundation of language and linguistics as well, right? It's very context specific, right? So when we think about effective business writing, right, that this course isn't necessarily about what is good business writing or what is bad business writing. It's what is effective business writing. So it's very appropriately titled in that way, because what is effective in one context is very much not effective in another context. So what that requires of you is obviously a sense of kind of material, physical experience with that, of just kind of I almost think of it in terms of, I always hate giving examples like this because if you've never played this game before, then this wouldn't make any sense, is Operation, right? That game you had perhaps as a child where like you would try to get the bone out of the man sitting on the table, and if you got too far to the edge, you buzz and you get a shock, right? I doubt it's in circulation anymore. Or maybe it is, I'm not sure. Anyways, regardless, it's kind of through trial and error, through knowing what works, not based upon reading these commandments or list of rules, but based upon experience and what works or what doesn't work based upon negative or positive feedback, right? So what you'll see is that someone could be a fantastic writer, right? Someone could be a poet laureate. Someone can be a fantastic novelist. But if put them in one specific situation, and they're not necessarily going to have to know because that situation requires its own way of speaking, its own way of writing. Even in your specific companies, you're probably starting to realize not only are there ways of communicating in my specific industry that I've chosen, right? In accounting, for example, there's specific acronyms used, there's specific ways of speaking, there's specific attitudes towards certain things, right? So you kind of are getting acculturated into this. But even within your specific company, there are specific ways of speaking, specific ways of writing memos / emails, right? Emails have largely replaced memos, but some workplaces certainly still use them. So all of this is very contingent, right? So circling back to that. So when 7 says, here are the things you need to know, right? Use contractions. Well, you might find 2 weeks later you're in a writing situation where you shouldn't use contractions, right? If you're writing to the public, for example, and you are thinking about the public or the corporate image of your brand or of your company, right? So you'll always see exceptions to the rule, and that's the most frustrating part about language, right? Is the fact that there are no rules. Even grammatical rules aren't necessarily rules, right? You can begin a sentence with and or but. You certainly can, right? The reason why it's frowned upon is because that was not the conventional way of doing it, right? Because it wasn't necessarily kind of a full sentence, right? But you certainly can. There's no, you're not breaking any specific rules. It's just you're breaking a convention. You're breaking a norm, right? And that's why you get a lot of maybe red ink on your paper or think, no, don't do this, when all your English teacher should have said was, this is not appropriate for this situation, right? In an academic paper, for example, you definitely don't want to do that because the context is different, because the attitude is different, because the discourse community is different. But in another context, certainly you can do that, right? So it's this frustrating realm of contingency and uncertainty and I guess relativity that can be very frustrating. So if you're looking for rules, there are certain best practices, certainly, but I like to think of those best practices as habits as opposed to kind of finer rules. So that's why I like this O'Hare piece specifically, because it focuses on this idea of habits or this idea of practice that I introduced last week. So I want you to focus on that. So the main thing that you're doing for week 2 is analyzing a letter that Target released to its red card holders after a data breach, right? So I'm having you look through. It's a 1-page public communication that was circulated through mail, and then I'm going to have you kind of break it down. So through that, we're going to be learning about rhetoric and about audience, right? So I could stand here or sit here, I guess, and talk to you about rhetoric and give you a full history of it and give you kind of a full theoretical model of it. That's less useful than me actually giving you questions that are guiding you to think about how to deconstruct or how to analyze a letter and whether or not it was effective or not. So, right, so I introduce a variety of questions. I'm having you apply some of the ideas from O'Hare and some of the ideas from Garner in the actual worksheet. I'm introducing a list of questions, right? This idea of habits, right? This idea of these types of questions can kind of be some are very specific to negative business messages, which is a genre of business message, negative communication, right? But also some of them are just, when you get a piece of communication, how do you analyze it, right? How do you analyze if that's effective or not? These are useful skills, and it's useful to think about this before you start engaging in your own writing practice for this class. So you don't have to know necessarily too much about the details of it, but I would encourage you to be a good graduate student and do research on it and go back and look at the facts and look at the context and all that stuff, right? That might certainly help you answer some of those questions. And break it down and answer questions. And ultimately, you're going to have to come to some sort of a conclusion whether or not the message was effective or not, right? And again, you'll see it breaks all sorts of rules that perhaps you thought were not appropriate, right? But perhaps perhaps they were appropriate or effective for that specific context. So I'm curious to see what you guys come up with. I'm curious to see about your analysis. I've aggregated the results of the survey that you took last week, right? And you can view them below this video. So they're just kind of in shareable format, just out of your interest, just to see. There's kind of pie charts and graphs and stuff like that, so you can kind of see where you and your other 34 peers are concerned, what your attitudes are, kind of what your experiences are. So I think it's good just kind of group building just to see where everyone's at. Maybe you'll have some sort of relatability, and that can be important. So again, as usual, if you have any questions about this week's assignment, don't hesitate to email me.